Hi guys, welcome to True Crime with Jen. Today I'm going to cover the story of John Email List. If you don't know about this story, I guarantee after you hear it, you'll never forget it. Okay, let's get right into it. The story takes place in Westfield, New Jersey, 1971. John List was married to Helen List, and they had 3 children. Patricia, who they called Patty, she was 16, John Jr., 15, and Frederick, 13. He met his wife Helen after college. Helen had been married once before, but her husband had passed away. And sometime shortly after they'd been dating, Helen told John that she was pregnant. And because of John's strict religious beliefs in the Lutheran faith, he knew getting married was his only option. But seriously, if he thought he got her pregnant, his religious beliefs had a little wiggle room. So John went ahead and married Helen shortly after this news in December of 1951, and then not long after they were married, Helen revealed that she actually wasn't pregnant at all. So John, again being a strict Lutheran, knew that divorce wouldn't be an option, and he stayed married. About 4 years later, they had begun their family, and Patty was their firstborn. So John felt immense pressure to take care of the financial needs of his family, as any father or husband would do, but he was an oddball. He was off-putting to many people. He rubbed people the wrong way, and although he was really meticulous with his job, he was very good with numbers, he was a hard worker, he followed through with everything. He just had some odd social skills, so unfortunately he could never seem to keep a job for very long. Eventually, he was able to secure a job as a vice president of a bank in New Jersey, and it seemed that all their financial problems would be over. So Helen insisted that John buy her the house of her dreams. This house was called Breeze Knoll. It was probably the most expensive home in the most expensive part of Westfield. It was a 19-room sprawling mansion. John didn't have the money to cover this home, but to avoid conflict with his wife, he decided to go to his mother Alma, who he had a very close relationship with, unlike his father, and ask her for a loan to help pay for the house. And in exchange for this loan, she was able to move into the 3rd story of the house into a self-secured apartment. Within a year, he was fired from that bank job. Again, this was all due to personality clashes. And instead of admitting failure to his wife, he chose to continue to get dressed in his suit every day, drive to the train station, get on the train, go a few stops, get off, sit at a train station, read a newspaper all day long, get back on a train, come back to his car, and go home. He had everybody fooled that he was going to work. And during this time that he was actually going bankrupt, he did have a few odd jobs here and there, but he was always let go from these jobs. He could never seem to handle keeping one for very long. So by 1971, he had gone bankrupt, and this presented a huge moral conflict for him because in his religion, poverty was considered a sin. And all he could see was that the next step would be charity and asking for help from people. So he couldn't face that. It was just another failure. He also had concerns that his teenagers were being influenced by popular American culture at the time. His oldest, Patty, who was 16, she was really into acting, and he felt that that was a corrupt profession. There's also rumors that she had been dabbling with marijuana. Ooh. And his wife, Helen, her health had been deteriorating over the years. She had been falling, she was losing sight in her right eye. It turns out that she was suffering from tertiary syphilis, which is like late stage syphilis. Apparently she'd contracted that from her first husband and had never shared that with John. So to handle this, she had become addicted to tranquilizers and she was drinking heavily. And because of all of this, she had stopped going to church, which was very unacceptable to John. So with all of these things going on in his life, no job, bankruptcy, his children are going in the wrong direction, his wife is just kind of a giant nuisance, John was coming up with a plan, silently for months. He had actually considered suicide. He was that unhappy, but in his religion, again, it's the only unforgivable sin. And although he seemed frustrated and very unhappy with his family and he felt like they were a giant burden on him, he actually felt love for them. He did. And so with great detail, he plotted his plan in what he felt was the most humane and loving way possible. On November 9th, 1971, the day started just like any other day. The kids came down for breakfast, they all left for school, And his wife eventually came down for her morning cup of coffee. So John and her exchanged just normal chit chat. And then, without hesitation, as Helen sat at the kitchen table drinking her coffee, John calmly walked up behind her with a 9mm pistol, pointed it to the back of her head, and shot her once through the head. The blast hit her so hard that her false teeth actually landed on the kitchen table, where she was now slumped over. The gun he had used had been given to him as a gift from his late father, who, again, he didn't have a very close relationship with, but it was something that he'd kept from him. So John drug her body on a sleeping bag and pulled her into this big grand ballroom that they never used. And the ceiling was made of this stained glass, this beautiful stained glass, and I'll get to that later why that's important, but that was part of the decoration of this room. So then John calmly walked upstairs to his mother Alma's apartment that was within the home, and he walked in and said good morning to his mother, gave her a kiss. She asked about the noise that she'd heard downstairs, and John said that he was wondering what it was too, and so that's why he came up to talk to her. And as she walked towards her door to maybe go look, he walked up behind her, put the gun to her temple, and pulled the trigger once and blew her brains out. Alma dropped to the floor. What he didn't expect is that Alma was much heavier than his wife, and he couldn't pull her down into the ballroom, so he covered her face with a towel and left her in her apartment. So back downstairs, he cleaned up what was a surprising amount of blood to him that had been left by Helen and her gunshot wound, and then he sat down and calmly wrote letters to his kids' schools, stating that the family needed to go to North Carolina to take care of a sick relative. Then he went to the post office to mail the letters, and he stopped all mail delivery to his home. He also stopped the newspaper and milk delivery to his home. John then went home and made a sandwich for himself and ate it happily in the kitchen while his mother and wife lay dead in other parts of the home. Patty was the first to come home. This is his 16-year-old daughter. She walked through the front door. John calmly snuck up behind her, put the gun to her head, and shot her once in the head. She dropped to the floor, died instantly. John put her body on a sleeping bag as well, drug her into the ballroom, and placed her next to her mother. He knew at this point that he couldn't stop this process of killing his family, because he knew if even just one family member was left, this would be just such a traumatic thing to have to endure, the loss of most of your family or all of your family, that he just knew he had to continue with his plan and execute it perfectly. So next home was Frederick the Baby, the 13-year-old. This one is just so, all of them are really sad, but I just think of this 13-year-old coming home so innocent from his probably day in the 8th grade, and probably coming home to think about what he wants to have to eat after school. So he walks through the front door, same as his sister. He's so unaware and doesn't even know what's about to happen. His father sneaks up behind him and again shoots him in the head. He drops to the floor and dies instantly. John puts him on a sleeping bag as well, pulls him into the ballroom, and lays him next to his sister. So John Jr., the 15-year-old, had a soccer game that day, so John List Sr. decided to go to the game instead of waiting for John to come home. He watched him play. He said he even played well, and that he seemed to be having a good day. They were done with the game, and then they drove home together, and as they walked through the front door, John shot John Jr. in the head. But what happened with John Jr. that didn't happen to the others is that he didn't seem to die instantly, or he wasn't sure. He said that he had muscle movement that wasn't happening with anybody else. So to make sure John Jr. was dead all the way, he shot him 9 more times. Once he was certain John was dead, he put him on a sleeping bag and drug his body into the ballroom and laid him next to Frederick. He then said a prayer over the bodies, and he went and cleaned up the blood everywhere as best he could. He sat down and had dinner. He had this sense of relief that his plan had been executed perfectly and that it was over and he was done with it, so he could move forward with the rest of his plan. He had also served in World War II, and he had experienced combat where he was actually shooting people, and then he would have to go and just, he had to eat, he was human. So he already knew this mindset of going out and killing and then having to eat. I'll get to that later, the PTSD. I think it's an important part of what happened here. So when he was done eating dinner, he washed his dishes, put them in the drainer to dry, got ready for bed, and went to bed and slept well that night with 5 dead bodies in his house. The next morning, he turned down the thermostat, hopefully to preserve the bodies. He turned on every light in the house, and he blasted classical music throughout the home. He was hoping that all of these details would hopefully deter any would-be intruders. He then sat down and wrote a 5-page letter to his pastor, who he was very close to, and he went around his house and cut out, this is such a creepy detail, he cut out every single picture of himself that was in the house. So I can only imagine there's all these framed pictures with a circle missing from where his face was. He then walked out the door, locked it, and left. He then drove his car to JFK International Airport, took a bus back to the city, and from there he took a train to Denver. In Denver, he applied for a new Social Security card under the name Robert Peter Clark. He got a job as a short order cook, and he started his new life in Denver. Meanwhile, at the mansion, weeks had gone by, and of course nobody's suspicious at this point. But what happens is lights start going out. They're burning out because they've been left on for almost a month. Because the List family was so reclusive, nobody really was concerned or aware or tipped off that something was off. It wasn't until Patty's drama teacher just had a gut feeling that the house needed to be checked on. Something was wrong. And it wasn't just that she hadn't been to class in a month because they were notified that she would be out. It was something that Patty had shared with him. And at one point, she told him that she was concerned that her father was going to kill her entire family. Another teacher went out to the house one night, and they're looking around trying to see if they can see anything through the windows, and I guess some neighbors spotted them, and they thought it was two strangers trying to break into the house, so they call the police. The police show up, and they tell the police why they are there, and the police are trying to look through the windows to see if they can see anything. Nothing looks odd. One of the neighbors knows about an open window that they can get through, so they use that. They're able to get into the house. As the police walk around the house, they make their way to the ballroom, they open up the curtain, and they're instantly hit with the smell of human decomposition. So they immediately put out an APB and all points bulletin on John Emil List. They find his car at the airport, but they can't find that he's gone on to any flight. They have no trace of him, no leads, no clues, not even a picture of him. Okay, so strangely, almost a year later in August of 1972, the house is caught on fire, which is widely believed to have been arson. And what they find out after going through the home is that the stained glass ceiling was signed no other than Louis Comfort Tiffany, aka Tiffany and Company. So that ceiling would have been worth at least $100,000, which would have easily fixed their financial problems with money left over, if he had only known. Over the years, the police followed up on every tip, sighting, and lead, but they always led nowhere. The police and press always made sure that the story was on the news on important anniversaries, like the 1-year anniversary, 5-year anniversary, to keep the case in the public eye. By 1989, the List case was over 18 years old, and there was a new show on Fox called America's Most Wanted. It had been out for over a year. And Captain Frank Moranka of the Union County Prosecutor's Office thought that this would be the perfect vehicle to get the story out there, bring some light to it, get it moving again, and hopefully find John List. However, the show initially turned them down. They considered the case too old and too cold. It wasn't until the host, John Walsh, caught wind of the case. If you aren't aware, John Walsh, who is the host of America's Most Wanted, not only was the host, but he was a victims' rights advocate due to the murder of his 6-year-old son, Adam. And because of his own son's murder, Walsh felt very strongly about finding List and bringing him to justice. The problem is they didn't have any current photo of List and what he might look like 18 years later. So Walsh got a hold of forensic sculptor Frank Bender to create an age-progressed bust of List. And for those that don't know, a bust is a sculpture of the head, shoulders, and chest. In addition to using the standard facial reconstruction measurements that most forensic anthropologists use, he also reached out to forensic psychologist Richard Walter to get a detailed psychological profile of List. So he also looked at pictures of List's parents to see how their faces had aged over the years, and using all of that information along with his own intuition, he created a bust of what List would look like now in his 60s. But they needed to find the right glasses that would match List now. So Bender went to a bunch of thrift stores and looked at a bunch of glasses. He finally found a pair that was very conservative, very FBI-looking, black frame. And once he had the glasses, the bust was finished. That's Frank Bender's bust on the left, and that's a real picture of John List on the right. It looks exactly like him. Okay, so back to America's Most Wanted. The case of John List aired on March 21st, 1989, and an estimated 22 million people saw the program, including true crime fans Wanda Flannery and her daughter Ava Mitchell in Denver. Even before the bust was shown, Flannery and Mitchell were sure their former neighbor Bob Clark fit the description. Soft-spoken, always wears a suit, an accountant, a devout Lutheran, and when Bender's forensic bust was shown on screen, they were absolutely stunned. It looked just like Bob Clark, right down to the glasses. So Flannery called the tip line along with 200 other people who had seen the show. 11 days later, the FBI showed up at Bob Clark's home. His wife was there, he was at work. So they showed up at Bob's work and they asked him if he was Bob Clark. He said yes. They asked him if he was John List and he said no. But his fingerprints matched perfectly with his handgun permit that he'd gotten back in New Jersey back in the day. So they knew they had their man. And even at one point, one of the officers said, "Come on, John, we know it's you." Here's a crazy fact. After List was arrested, he admitted that he used to watch America's Most Wanted, and he wondered if his story was ever going to be part of their show. And he said that he actually caught the very tail end of the show that he was on. So he actually knew that his days of hiding were coming to an end. So List was arrested and charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. His trial began April 2nd, 1990. That was 18 and a half years after he murdered his family. List was diagnosed by the court psychiatrist with obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, which his defense said made him only guilty of second-degree murder instead of first-degree murder. So apparently if you have OCD, they felt that the planning portion of murdering people should be excused. On April 11th, the jury found him guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder. He was given the maximum sentence allowed at the time, which was 5 consecutive life terms. When his sentence was read aloud, the courtroom actually erupted in applause. And although the public was really happy, there was one person who wasn't happy, and that was John Walsh. John Walsh really wanted him to get the death penalty. Many in law enforcement, including John Walsh, credit Bender's amazingly accurate bust with cracking one of the oldest cases at the time. In fact, Walsh kept that bust in his office for many, many years. List later appealed his case, saying that he had suffered PTSD from combat and war, which was denied by the courts. At this point, any speculation about his mental state was off the table, but the author of an article I read, her name was Delaney Bartlett, she wondered if he had been on the spectrum for autism. When you think about his focus, how meticulous he was good with numbers, he was an accountant, he was lacking social skills, and he'd also been diagnosed with OCD, which is a trait of autism, but also at the same time, many OCD traits carry the same traits as autism. She said in watching her interviews, she was convinced that he had autism. This was mainly based on the fact that she had a son with autism that she'd raised, so she knew what to look for. She said before speaking with psychiatrists, police, or television hosts, he would carefully, even fussily, arrange items on a table. His manner seemed flat and emotionless, and his tone of voice barely changing. And this is just my 2 cents. I think he definitely suffered from PTSD from combat in the war. We know now that men who serve in war, that they can come home with PTSD and they end up being this violent person that they never were before they went to combat. Autism was never considered a possibility and PTSD was rejected by the courts, so we'll never know if either of those things would have played into his appeals had it happened later. And would it have changed the case? We'll never know. List died of pneumonia in prison on March 21st, 2008. He was 82 years old. I just want to end this by saying that I am a true crime junkie at heart. I've been following true crime since I was a teenager. I've read tons of books on true crime before we had the internet to go to. I probably listen to at least 10 podcasts on a regular basis, also some YouTube channels. I dabbled about a year ago in the Chris Watts case and had put that on my other channel, and people had encouraged me to go ahead and try this. So this is the first time that I've tried this from beginning to end with one case, and if you guys like it, I will definitely try more. Thanks again for watching, and please like this video. Hopefully it will give it some momentum. And then also please share any thoughts in the comments. Okay guys, thanks for watching. See you soon. Bye.